the topic that you wanted to present, and then we could go through a bit of an interaction, given the diversity of the teams represented here. And also, I would want to stress and recognize the importance of having the Deputy Director for the ESP5 team here, Shukri. That's obviously his interest in being here shows that we have a good momentum coming up in addressing many of the issues that are central to your sub-region. So, okay. Klaus, go ahead.
Something that I can move the presentation forward. Okay, good. So start with the next one. That is the theme. You know who I am. That is what I'm going to talk about. Where are the forests in the Caribbean? When I speak of the Caribbean, I refer to the English-speaking Caribbean. The office out of Barbados had the responsibility for all the island, including Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, and then about 3 years ago, Cuba and Dominican Republic are now being attended by Panama. So we, from the sub-regional office in Barbados, we basically cover CARICOM. CARICOM is the economic unification of the former English colonies with a couple of adjacent or related governments or states. So it's basically the English-speaking Caribbean we are talking about now here as the Caribbean. The Caribbean is wider. There's a Central American part of it, but the two areas are basically don't have much to do with each other. So that's important to know. I think the last person who was able to travel without any problems through the Caribbean or crossing the language borders was Columbus. After that, there's a very strict there's a large difficulties in crossing language borders with a plane. Seems to be possible. There are good connections between the countries, the English-speaking countries, between the Spanish-speaking countries and the French-speaking countries, but it's always difficult to cross between islands who have different languages. And it didn't get better over the last 20 years. I have a map from my father-in-law from 40 years ago. There were far more connections through the Caribbean, crisscross, than they are now. Now we are pretty much centralized, also mentally. All flight connections go to Miami, and some to London, and very few to Latin America. So it is basically it's an island, a regional island in the continent. Now, what happened in these areas? Now, what happened to the forest? How does it change? What are the drivers of degradation, resilience, and what is we can observe in restoration? And so these are the topics which deal with forestry matters. And then I will put this whole thing into a larger context, which I call here the social dimension. Next one. Now, quick overview. In the Caribbean, we have three basic groups of countries. They have the smaller islands, like Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, St. Lucia, all these small dots you see on the map. And we have the larger, the Greater Antilles. These are Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, and we have the continental countries. The continental countries are basically Suriname, Guyana, and Belize. Now, when you look at the interesting part is that forest on the island covers roughly 1/3 of the land space, and with very high population densities. They are kind of similar between the larger and the smaller Antilles, about 250 people per square kilometer. Now, when you compare that with the continental countries, you have something like 80% forest cover, and you have 6 people per square kilometer. So that is important to understand. The continental countries retained their forest, but they retained the forest not so much because they loved the forest or they wanted it, there were just not enough people to cut it down. While on the islands, they have a very high population density, the land was used over the last 300 years for agriculture, and soon after the European colonizers arrived, the forest was cleared and the land was used for agriculture. Next one. Now, when we look at how this changed over the centuries, over the decades, we can differentiate between three different phases of forest in the landscape. The first one was basically the forest was a land reserve. Wherever forest was available, it was cut down, and it was an unregulated source for timber. Next one, that is the second phase now. Then the people realized, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should retain something of it. That is the second phase where forest reserves were established, timber harvesting regulations were established, and the forest was a source of timber and continued to be a land reserve for other land uses. In this period, we see the establishment of forest plantation management, very little managing of natural forest or natural regeneration, and a few interventions in natural forests. I would say they basically remained at the experimental stage. So that is the situation on the islands. Next one. Now we have this third phase, which is basically the decline of agriculture. What happened? And we have an emerging secondary forest on agricultural land. The most interesting example of that, and in a way I would say the forerunner for all the other islands, maybe Puerto Rico. In the 1940s, Puerto Rico had a land forest cover of 8%, and the rest was sugarcane. After the sugarcane was abundant, then now the forest started to regenerate on its own, and the current forest cover is something of 70%. Most of the countries of the forest is the composition is species, introduced species. The most frequent tree in Puerto Rico is the African tulip tree. So we have a restoration of an ecosystem based or with basically foreign or introduced species. You can call them invasive. Whether they are considered to be invasive or not is the question, whether they are wanted or not. Leucaena, for example, was introduced as a fodder plant, was brought into the islands as the miracle tree. Everybody was very happy. The goats were supposed to eat it, and it was to generate carbon and all the good things. Now it basically regenerates large tracts of the island. It has an important ecological role in covering the watersheds, but it has very little economic value. So next one. So what we have to learn from that is forest is changing, the vegetation cover is not static. It changes according to the demand for land, and what we can see is that generally, and that holds, forest is the last and the least appreciated land use. In Barbados, in the 20 years I was there, forest cover rose from probably 2 or 3% to something like now, I would say 20 or 25%. But it is this Leucaena bush. So, and I have had a discussion with my colleague from the agricultural department. I told him, you know, the success of the reforestation of the Caribbean depends on the failure of the agricultural policy. People leave agriculture. Agriculture has a very low potential to generate income, and so the abundant land goes back into forest. Traditionally, the Caribbean islands had two main products. One was sugar, and the other one was banana. Both of them were kind of crippling along until the early 2000s, and then WTO took away the preferential trade access of these products to the European community, and that basically was the death of the export of both products. Next one. So I want to give you a few examples. Next one. So here you have a picture from Suriname. Lowland forest, which you can see on the left side, was converted into agriculture fields. That is a picture from the coastal area. Next one. This is a picture of the natural succession. You have a leucaena growing on an abandoned sugarcane field. This is the early stages. You see the sugarcane still in the middle of it, and the leucaena growing up to a height of about 2 or 3 meters. Next one. If you have more water, and then you see that this forest cover develops into what we would call a complete or established secondary forest. It is, in this case, most of it is an introduced species. It is mixed also with native species, so, and hopefully under the shadow of these invasive or primary forests, you have now a long-term introduction of the native species, which can actually happen. The risk is, that you see the small picture on the left, this process can be changed and reversed any time. For example, if there is an interest in palm oil, or if, and that is not so much the case for Barbados and for the islands, but residential areas. Every landowner in Barbados goes to bed every night and prays that his piece of agricultural land may be dedicated to become residential, because then he becomes, from a poor man, he will become a millionaire overnight. And if he has good political contacts and he has any kind of ways of connections that his land may be dedicated to, as zoned as a residential area, or then that is the interest in it. So the land is, again, basically is a land reserve of the forest. The people are waiting until they get the permission to change it into something which is sellable and makes money. Next one. In the mountain areas and more on the larger islands, let's say Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Cuba, you have still agriculture as a slash and burn agriculture. Let's say, especially on the larger island, let's say Jamaica and Dominican Republic, you can observe that the good agricultural lands in the coastal areas are abandoned or left alone, but poor people in the upper watersheds still have to continue to do their slash and burn agriculture. If the island is small enough that the people who live up in the hills can reach the coastal area where they can find employment in the hotel industry, then this threat is not so high. As soon as the island grows, more people are bigger. The island doesn't grow, but if the island is bigger, then you see there is still a risk of converting mountain forest into agriculture land. It is, in general, next picture. It is this risk is currently not too high because there are little export crops which cultivated in this area. Other threats are, you see here, a golf course in Carriacou. So again, forest converted into a golf course, or let's say the next one is St. Lucia. You see a swimming pool in front of the pitons, and so very kind of it's very attractive for high value residential properties, and most of them, or many of them, are owned by foresters, by foreigners. And there was a change in the land regulations since about 5 to 10 years. Foreigners were allowed to buy land on the Caribbean islands. This created a certain boom in the building industry, which lasted until 2008, with the collapse of the let's say, of the world economy. Then all these kind of loose money was around to invest into second homes in the Caribbean was no longer available, and the rising land prices in the Caribbean slowed down, and also the demand for these high properties. But I'm pretty sure it will come back. So as soon as there are again back enough rich people who don't know what to do with their money, we will have another set of these residents going up on these islands. Next one. Another, you see here a condominium, let's say the mangrove areas in the coastal areas, in the Caribbean islands, the mangrove areas, especially on the smaller islands, which were steep, were very small. But there were small pockets of mangroves, but these were, most of them were gone now, and they are converted into marinas, into ports and condominiums close to the hotels close to the sea. In Belize, the situation is a little bit different. They have large extension of mangroves, and many of them were converted into shrimp farming. Next one. We have this a picture from the port of Spain. You see, rural areas are abundant. Everybody moves into the city, and it gives you an idea of the typical problem of a urban area in the Caribbean. It is located at the shoreline, and you have the mountain areas right in the back, which are difficult to settle. So all the people basically sit on a very small strip of land along the coastline with the back to the mountains and the front to the sea. What you see there is you see at the upper corner of the picture a large green area, which is left alone. This was bought by the first British governor of Trinidad in 1800 and something. It was an estate. He bought it and gave it to the city with the dedication that no permanent building should be erected on that place. So these 75 hectares are still open, and funny enough, it was respected for the last 200 years, and it is now kind of a green lung in the city. So, but it is really the exception. Everything else normally is cast in concrete. Next picture. Logging, let's say as it is pictured here, is not likely to happen neither in Guyana nor in Suriname. What you have there is a selective logging at rates which are rather low. The interventions take about 5 to 10 cubic meters per hectare, so it's very low, although the destruction connected with this logging, it damages far more trees than this 10 hectares. To what extent the best picture to describe that would what you see on the left top. Suriname, Guyana export the majority of their logs as round logs, and that is really a problem. There's very little kind of value-adding industry in these two countries, and the same applies for Belize. Next one. A problem on the islands is unmanaged wildfire. Here you have a picture right after a fire. Next one. And this fire is very often associated with invasive grasses. Here it is lemongrass. Lemongrass was introduced in Antigua. It's a picture from Antigua to stabilize the land. The lemongrass now became invasive, and it has a very bad habit. It burns, and every time it burns, it eats itself another 10 or 15 meters into the dry forest. And then the affected areas sprout back as lemongrass. So it's kind of creeping into the forest, and the reason for the fact that it burns is it's not naturally that it ignites by itself. It is put on fire by people who use the lemongrass when it grows back to feed their cattle, because the land is not is owned by the government, and the government only gives it out on short-term leases for a year to farmers. So there is very little incentive to have a sustainable program for land husbandry. So the problem here is the invasive grass, but the underlying problem is the land tenure system and the little incentive for people to really invest and to prevent to invest into good agricultural and husbandry practices. And the reason for that not to happen is that the land is basically used as a political currency. So if somebody wants land from the government, then it is something politicians can give away. And this mixture actually results in this spreading of the lemongrass. It's not a natural disaster, it's a combination of a political one and a natural situation.